Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Design Recharge. I'm your host, Diane Gibbs, and I'm joined with my friend, I don't know how to say that. Anyway, my friend Joe, full name, Joseph Carter Brown. And if I was doing full name, it'd be Anthony Joseph Carter Brown, right?
Joseph Anthony Carter
Joseph
Brown.
Anthony. All right, well, I'm going to mess it up either way. But I'm going to call him Joe for the rest of the remainder of the time, and I'm excited to have him back. We had him on me and the mouse in my pocket, had him on in January, and we talked about fear, and we're going to dig into that just a little bit more, and then kind of talk about this other empathy, which he's really talking about in a new talk, which he'll get to. But Joe, give us a little bit of your background and welcome to the show again.
Well, thanks. So my background, I am a converted computer nerd turned designer. Really, I like tinkering with things. That's how I got into design, just trying to figure out as much as I could about different things as a kid and trying to find things that I wanted to do, being a homeschool kid at the time. And, was in love with journalism, and by way of a computer crash and files getting corrupted, I said, well, I want to figure out how to stop this from happening. And then I started learning more about computers, and then I learned more about computers, and I was like, oh, this is sort of cool. And then I was like, well, let me learn how to make websites. And then I was like, well, maybe I should learn how to make these websites look good.
And this is young. You're young at this point. This is in high school or middle school at some point, right?
15, 16 in that range. And then that became like my obsession / dedication where it was just, it became, I think I really got into design because it was sort of like, I realized quickly that it was an excuse to learn as much as I could about a lot of different things. That was sort of how I found design. And then that's really been my excuse for doing design for all these years now, is just because I get to learn about all types of different things that I wouldn't normally get a chance to in other areas.
Right. In other fields, it's more focused, and that's the beauty about design, is if you get tired of doing one thing, you can really start studying something else and get into something else. That's a beauty of our field. It is endless, I think. So there's the thunder. Tell me if you can hear that.
I can't.
But, okay, that's good. Hopefully we'll just keep our internet. That's all I really care about. So you were on the show.
Diane, if I'm that boring, you don't have to make up an excuse.
No. Look at how dark it is. It's not usually this, like, I think the only we were talking about this earlier. Now I'm like the regular color, but I really should have probably turned a light on in my office. I don't ever turn it on. Anyway, so you're back. You were on the you were on the show back in January, and you were talking about fear. And a lot of this stuff, like, hey, I can figure it out, sometimes I think kind of gets in school, it gets pressed out of us, because so your curiosity was really one of the a great superpower for you, I think, because you haven't ever let that determine you or be an obstacle just because you didn't know how to do something. Or you hadn't ever given a talk when you were at the Apple store. They would do these talks teaching people about different software, and then you kind of just got handed it to you, and you had sat in on enough of them, you knew what to say, you knew how to use the programs. But that's something, I guess, in the very beginning, I want to make sure people understand what I'm saying when we're talking about fear. You've developed this kind of philosophy of even a little bit more than when we talked in January. And you've actually given a couple talks on the facing your fear kind of thing. What are some ways we can break down and embrace our fears? Because I feel like that's one of your talking points, and not let them control us.
Yeah. I sort of take the almost like project management type of idea when it comes to dealing with fear or things that I guess freak me out. and that sort of just breaking it down into smaller chunks. I find when I'm working on a project, even it looks really daunting when I'm going, man, this is going to be a huge website that I have to develop for, and it's all this stuff that I have to do, and you get overwhelmed. And it's sort of the same thing when you think of like, the fear. I mean, even with developing the talk, which I was in, even still developing it in January. And I remember in our pre-talk, I was like, no, don't talk about it yet. I'm not ready. It's not there. But it was very much like once I started taking it and breaking it down into smaller things, that it was like, well, this is why I'm freaked out about it. This is what it is. Like, these are the elements that are making me nervous. So if it's, the reason I was nervous about it was because I didn't feel like I had my content all the way settled in a cohesive format. So I was like, all right, well, let me figure out how I tell this story. And then it was like, all right, now I'm a little nervous because I haven't practiced it. Well, now let me make sure I practice it. And instead of looking at it as like, I just have to do this one thing at this one point, it was like, I have to do these smaller elements that then help me build up to going into the other side of doing it. And I see, I'm going to give a shout out to Jess Buswell, who's in here, who's one of the project managers here. So I hope I did a good job of explaining the project management style. I probably butchered the idea of it.
I think you did good. I'm sure he'll let us know over on he gave a big smile. So that's good. So really looking at a lot of fear is perspective, right? Instead of thinking of it as this huge thing, maybe it's something you even have talked about, being friends with fear. So why really analyzing what is it? Because sometimes that's what it is. It's the what ifs they get in our head, and that becomes bigger than the actual thing of actually doing it. And I find that happens to me a lot. Like, I'm like, oh my goodness, I've got all this stuff to do. And it's like, just take one at a time, one step at a time, right?
Yeah. And I mean, that's, one of those things too, where, like you said, with the what if, or, you'll ask like, well, what if this happens? Like, what if this really terrible thing happens? I'm like, yeah, sure, this really terrible thing could happen. But what if this really awesome thing happens behind? Like, what if you do it and it's just really amazing, and you find something that you didn't realize was there? And like, that's something that I always put into like my daughter's head, because I'll tell her to try something or do something, and she'll be like, why? And I'll go, well, why not? And so it's sort of like that type of thing where you're like trying to justify. It's almost like you'll justify why you can't do it, and I'll be like, well, what if I can do it? What if, why can't I do it? Like, why is it not possible for me to do?
So what are some of the downsides of fear? So talk about that a little bit, analyze that a little bit more, of the inner talk that holds us back, because it's not usually grounded in something that's reality. And I think as a parent to child, you see that because it's, again, perspective. But what are some things that would help us when we're kind of in the middle of a storm?
Well, so I think we've had the conversation about like how I like words, and I like dissecting words and what they mean. And so like, I think that generally we look at fear as a negative word, and I don't necessarily agree with that. So I sort of look at it at the downside of sort of, I look at it as like being as fear versus being afraid, like when you're in fear, you're still being active normally. You're still like I'm in fear of something, but I'm still pushing forward through it. And that's, to me, like a positive reaction to fear. But the negative reaction is like being afraid, where you like freeze up and you're just too afraid to do anything. So I guess, those downsides, are, and they're things that I've had to deal with, whether it's being like self-destructive. And I can look at even my time as, I was 18 years old when I started at Apple. So, I was still very much a kid learning how to like work with people. And then having been homeschooled, I was learning how to actually work with people much more, so I had to learn interpersonal skills and those.
But that's a normal thing, not necessarily homeschool. I mean, there's lots of kids that are homeschooled, but a lot of designers can be really introverted. So you had to kind of come out of your shell. So can you dig into that a little bit, and also what you would do in a situation, how you've had to just go take one step forward, or how you've had to get over freezing up, things like that?
So I like humor. So I've just learned to make fun of myself, and in a way, I learned to like acknowledge it, and for me, that's maybe like the humanizing aspect of it is when I stand up in front of a group of people, like I usually am freaking out. But at the same time, if I admit that, then it's sort of like, oh, well, like it doesn't bother me as much because, usually what happens is you're like trying to hide, this fact that you're unsure about something. Whereas like when I just say, hey, guess what? I'm sort of freaking out right now, but I'm going to keep going. Usually people have respect for it. They, because most people wouldn't want to go and do that thing. Or in the same, on the same end, when you're doing something and somebody is, if someone's like, oh, well, you're so nervous. And I'm like, well, at least I did it. At least I tried. Like, are you going to go and try? Like, you're probably not willing to because you're too afraid to. At least I was willing to try. And, so yeah, I don't know. I guess I just try and look at those words or those things that are considered negative and see how I can turn them into a positive. Maybe that's like my, what's the term? Is it Pollyanna? Like that sort of mentality of like taking everything and trying to turn it into a positive. I guess sometimes that can be a fault, but yeah, I mean, that's just sort of how I am. I like try and take things and say, okay, well, where's the positive in this? So, whether it's fear or like, I mean, usually it comes from, the feeling of failing. But I remember when I was, in school, somebody said something or somebody showed me a quote that really has resonated with me since. And it was like, if you're not failing, you're not trying. So I sort of adopted this idea of like, I'm going to actually try and fail, like, and if I'm willing to fail, then that fear doesn't feel as bad because I was willing to fail. I knew that, like I know I might suck at this thing. And if I can acknowledge that, but I still try, maybe I don't suck as much as I thought I did. And at least I tried. And if I fail, then, oh, well,
Yeah, at least it is trying. It's kind of a lot of self-talk is what you're inside your head. You're having these conversations.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I like to say I talk to myself because I'm the sanest person I know. But yeah, I'm always talking to myself.
So in your kind of changing roles, you've called yourself and we talked about this a little bit last time, a dev-ziner. So it's sort of like a developer and a designer. And in your role at your job, you do have to communicate with the developers. You also have to know what their languages are and things like that. But then you also really have to understand the designer and from the designer perspective, which is great. And I think you're doing a little bit more management in this role, and I could be wrong, but
Yeah, so recently we had some shifts to how we're working and operating a little more as like a design team and managing just the design aspect within the company, trying to bring a little more of that designer understanding to the table. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it is, having empathy for what developers go through,
right.
And for me, I think it's a benefit because when I start working on, say, like a comp design for a website, I look at it and say, okay, well, I'm going to design this thing and I think it's going to look good, but I know that the developer is going to have a hell of a time doing it and they're going to hate me afterward. And it's going to push, it's going to make more problems than, even though it might look nice, even though I think it's going to be a good solution overall, you have to balance those things. And so being able to have that understanding of what will have to go into it gives a better appreciation. And I think usually like the developers here appreciate that more because they know that you're almost looking out for them. So they know that if there's, they almost know that like myself and my design partner here, Matt, who I don't know if he can hear me, he's got headphones on. I hope I'm not talking too loud for him. But like I think we're both really good at trying to taking it with an understanding of what the developer is going to face while still trying to keep those design ideals in line. But yeah, I think it's a really important thing that I think sometimes designers will tend to neglect because they think, oh, well, I have to know all this code. And it's like, no, you just need to know how to work with, again, empathy toward what the developer is going to go through, and you can't just think about yourself and what you want to design, because at the other point, like, if you're not developing it, somebody else has to do it, and you can either
Right.
make their life more miserable, or you can try and save them time on the front end.
Right. Well, so what about, are you also having to do some of that, talk about fear of failure or the fear thing with some of the people on your team and help them kind of motivate them? Is this really just something you're kind of doing in your, maybe an AIGA or for yourself? You're not necessarily doing it in your team so much.
Yeah, I mean, so when I first developed the talk, I did present it to the team, and just sort of to get feedback. And I definitely think that it's helpful, but I think it was more of a outward facing, or outside of the office type
Right.
of conversation.
So why do you think it is, and this was one of my questions to you, but so if today was my first day using the pen tool or something,
Mm-hmm.
why do I not want to fail at that? Why do you think some people, when they're trying new things, they don't want to be seen as incompetent? It seems ridiculous that, the first time you're reading Shakespeare that you would be able to memorize it, or, know it word from word. I mean, we don't think of this in anything else, but why so much? Is it because we're professionals? And I mean, but we're always learning new things, but that incompetence and that fear of failure, or that fear that somebody will find out that we don't know.
Right.
Why, do you have an idea of why we do that?
I mean, I think it is, like you said, the sort of that feeling of seeming incompetent. I think when you get to a certain point, you feel like you're supposed to know, like, oh, I'm supposed to know better. So, if I don't know, then I look like I'm not qualified in other areas. Um, and yeah, so I think it just ultimately comes down to, and it's probably ego. It's probably just the fear of feeling like you're maybe letting someone down sometimes. If you're asking me to do something, like, I sometimes have a fear of just letting people down in general. So I'll freak out when I don't know something sometimes, because I'm like, well, I'm supposed to know this. I'm supposed to know this for that person, because if I don't, I let them down.
But
And so,
if somebody was working for you, somebody was on your team, a developer or a designer, and they were new and they started asking you questions, you would never be like, you should know that, right? You really, more than likely, you're like, oh, good question. Let me tell you how we do it here, or
yeah.
right? Like, I don't know why people really think that. I
I
mean,
mean, I guess there's I guess it's a dual edge. You feel like, again, you feel like sometimes maybe you should know certain things. And I mean, I've had that here. I mean, when I first started, one of our guys just left recently, and I was joking with him. He was one of our lead developers here. And I joked that, the first few months he helped me keep my job, because I was so I don't know if you're familiar with like development workflows, but we use a tool called Git, which is like for versioning and version tracking, and like storing code and things like that. And it was such a frustrating thing for me to get a grasp of, because there's like branches, and you have different conflicts that'll happen because somebody's working on one branch, and it no longer works on your branch, and you have all these different things that happen. And I get so nervous at times, because I'm like, oh my, I should know this. I'm taking his time every time I have to go and ask him a question, because he's got things he needs to do, and he's got to stop and help me, and I'm screwing this up. And like, I remember having this little cheat sheet that I wrote just so that I wouldn't have to like bug him every time of little things that I needed to do. And so I actually gave that to him as like a token of appreciation on his last day. But it was still very much that thing of, I'm working in this environment with all these developers, and it's like they all understand Git. Why don't I? So it's sort of,
oh,
you
right.
compare yourself sometimes. You start to think like, well, I should know, and I'm taking someone else's time. I'm a professional, so yeah, I should know all the things. I should be able to figure it out. So I think those are all of those things. So and that sort of goes back to like those downsides of the fear and being afraid, is like you start to procrastinate, and it's like, because you don't want to ask for it, you you hope that it comes to you at some point, or sometimes you might even like start to self-destruct. And I even had to deal with some of those things at times where it's like I could feel myself like getting to this point where I just be like, I'm just not good enough at this. I should just go ahead and quit while I'm ahead. And I'd be like, no, that's not that's not how
But
this should work.
but it's also self-empathy. At those points, you were not empathizing with yourself at all. You were like, you should know this. And it's kind of like this terrible self-talk that you're telling, but you're doing something new that you've never used. So
Right.
empathy kind of goes both ways, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's, yes, I guess it's empathy and efficacy even,
Mm.
you know, I know for me getting into this, this work or what I was doing is like, I worked really hard to get there. So you feel like you now need to prove yourself sometimes. And so you get nervous on that end. But that's sort of also why, like, when it comes to going back to your question about ways of like breaking it down and things like that, one thing that I've always tried to do is like find things that remind me of the fact that like I can figure it out. So whether it's looking at my time at being at the Apple store and being this young kid who was 18 and never had a job before and thought like, holy crap, I can't work with these other guys who are salespeople, like who have been salespeople or, long time tech guys. And, somehow I ended up being fine there and being one of the top salespeople and, doing all these things that I didn't think I would be able to do, even though I was telling myself I wouldn't, or, whether it was running my own company for 7 years in the middle of a really nasty economic downturn and being able to survive through that. Or even going back to like when I went back to school to finish my degree and having these moments where I was just like, oh man, they're going to figure me out. Like they're going to be like, this dude's terrible. Like, why are you coming to a design school? You're not a designer, but somehow I graduated as valedictorian in my class and like, all these things. So I actually just sort of created this, or not created, but I used this thing that I'll call it the valedictorian effort, because like my joke about being a valedictorian was like, well, it really doesn't mean anything in a design school. Like, I mean, like that's nothing, it just means that I put in the work. But it wasn't like it didn't necessarily mean my work was good enough. I just knew how to get good grades at my work, but in a way it was about the effort that I was willing to put in. So that's what I'll say. So even in those times where I was looking at things and saying, well, oh, I'm not good enough at this, or I should just give up and just quit it, I tell myself, I'm like, Joe, that's not a valedictorian effort. Like, that's not valedictorian effort, Joe. And like that would sort of motivate me to be like, all right, well, if I can make it through that thing, I'm going to just keep pushing my way through this and see what happens.
Right. So Dan had a question. Have you noticed whether or not your self-talk changes when you spoken aloud? Would you say the same when others can hear you? I think that's a really great question.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I think in some ways the talk probably changes a little more to me making fun of it as opposed to it being like a serious thing. Again, I do like, humor, and I do joke about a lot of things. And usually when I'm nervous or any of those types of things, I usually will joke about it. So yeah, I've definitely found that, again, if I make it something that's funny, it doesn't seem as daunting or it doesn't seem as overbearing. So yeah, I would definitely say that it does change, just because like I'll still be saying the same things, but I'm saying it in a more humorous manner.
Right.
And I guess it causes me to look at it in a different light.
Because if others were around, would you ever say it alone, out loud, if you were alone?
Oh, out loud if I'm alone? Probably, because again, I've definitely found myself having like these really long conversations with myself where I'm like, man, people probably think I'm nuts right now. Just having an actual conversation where I'm answering and asking myself questions,
Right. But I think that's good. So Doc said something earlier. He said being creatives have a tendency of being perfectionists as well. I think that lends itself to ego, and that the ego has to, and they have to be right. And then he also said pride. Pride was the silent killer because we don't want to be found out, right? And then Carly just said she read somewhere that the biological feeling of fear is actually the same as the feeling of excitement. So in theory, we could use that to help change the freeze fear mindset to a more positive and motivated one. So I love that. That's awesome. So you've also kind of talked about the positives of fear, and then we're going to go really more into the empathy and stuff like that and how they're kind of connected. But some of the positives are your senses are heightened. What other positive things can happen when we embrace fear? And you had given the example of Key and Peele, and maybe you can tell us about that one.
Yeah. So obviously the sort of the biological usage of fear, where your senses are heightened. You're actually a little more like things become a little more acute to you. You know, you're actually able to respond in a slightly higher manner just because you're sort of so on edge in a way. So yeah, and I think the idea of it, I think I've heard a little bit about that or seen something in reference to the feeling of fear being the same as excitement. So yeah, I think that's I don't know. I think that's a good thing, and it's usually a response just letting you know you need to prepare for something. Mm-hmm. You know, so in the way I look at it is I've seen that the things that I was most freaked out about were the things that ultimately end up being some of the best things that I've done. So now when I get that feeling of like being in fear of something, I'm like, holy crap, there's something really awesome about to happen. You know, like something really cool that could be right behind that corner if I just push through with it. Right. And working my way through it. And that's sort of the parallel I draw in the talk to Key and Peele, because it was a really cool story. I was listening to them on NPR, and I think it was Michael Key, I think that's his name.
These are two comedians, right?
Right, it's two comedians. They had a show on Comedy Central. One of them, Jordan Peele, did the movie Get Out, and and it was just an interesting story they were telling, Key was telling about how they got their start, really, which was they were both on Mad TV. Or actually, so they started out as friends. They had come across each other and they connected really quickly because they were both very similar. They were both comedians. They were I think had just moved to LA, so they were getting used to a new place. They're both biracial, so they had all these little things that sort of connected them to each other. And so they became friends. And then over the years, they would sometimes cross paths at an audition or something, but they both ended up on Mad TV. And he was talking about how they were on Mad TV, and one day they were hanging out after or in between shows or in between tapings. And Jordan Peele had said to Key, he goes, well, he says, you know what's happening, right? Or he's like, what's going on, right? And he's like, well, yeah, man, we're, doing what we always wanted to do. We're working together. We're blah, blah. And he goes, no, man. He's like, we're competing against each other. He's like, we're too similar for them to keep both of us. He's like, we're just too close together for them to keep both of us. So we're obviously competing against each other. Whoever does better is going to be the one they keep, and the other person will go off and do something else. So there was that fear of, well, I need to be better than this other person, right? But they decided that their response would be to figure out how they could use that to their benefit. So they took it and they started working and writing all their sketches together. So anytime anytime one of them did a sketch, it was both of them. Anytime there was some comedy or something that somebody found funny, it wasn't just Jordan or Key who was coming up with it. It was both of them. So you couldn't separate them. And, they didn't do that because they were like, if we do this, we're going to have one of the highest rated shows on Comedy Central in 10 years. It's like, no, they did it because they were freaked out of what would happen if they didn't make it. Obviously, you're in a spot where you've always wanted to be. So you want to have that self-preservation, but at the same time, they had this response that was mainly due to a fear that they had, and being able to use that as a positive became much bigger than either of them could have imagined.
So I think it does kind of wrap back. Instead of it just being a solo focus, a pride focus, they teamed up together, which happens all the time in design.
Yeah.
We have to really work to each other's strengths, and we don't want to double up. You know, if you're really good at hand lettering and I'm really good at something else, then it would be better if you do the hand lettering and not me try to do that as well. So really kind of working to our strengths and making sure that we both are needed at the same time. So Doc had another comment question. He said, what's the difference between being confident and pride? I think we all suffer from having confidence. How do you take pride in your work, being confident, without being a prideful person? Do you have an answer for that?
So confident versus pride. I mean, I think both are good things to have. I think pride is more of that's actually a good question. In some ways, I think they're similar terms. I think pride is maybe it's more about what you can do with something, versus confidence is your ability to accomplish something. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you give me a website to style out, like I have confidence that I can accomplish that task, but like my pride makes me want to make it look as good, or, be very clean code, or because I just take pride in my work so that it's as best as it can be.
Because it reflects on you.
I can make it as, that I can have that pride,
Right. So sometimes pride is a negative, right? So it's overconfidence or cockiness.
Right.
And there is a difference between, but I like how you said pride is a positive, but if you're overly cocky, that's different than being confident. Confident is about your abilities. I know I can get through it. I can muster through it if doesn't come super easy. But overconfidence or cockiness is not something, because that doesn't come across as a team player. So with the Key and Peele, they definitely weren't about cockiness and who was better, had to be bigger. They actually took it together, and then they made something that they both could be proud of and confident in.
So I guess it's a matter of, again, how you view pride, because I don't think it's wrong to have pride in something, but being like prideful. And that's sort of the idea of when we were talking about like the downsides of like that destructing aspect of like, well, I have so much, you have too much pride that you won't ask somebody for help, or you won't take a step back and like be able to, put yourself in a vulnerable position, because, again, I should know better, or I shouldn't have to ask someone, you know what I mean? I shouldn't have to ask somebody for help. So I'll just, be prideful. And one of the most important lessons I actually learned when I worked for Apple was, they used to tell us when it came to like helping people in tech support types of instances, they were like, they were always like, don't try and pretend you know something. Like, don't tell somebody, or if a customer comes in and they have a problem with a piece of software, and like there are plenty of resources for you to find the answer. Like the best way you can gain respect from a client or a customer is just by telling them you don't know straight up, and not being like, oh well, you told me some issue that you're having with your iPod, you don't really know, but I'm going to make up some BS answer because I don't want to look like I don't know. Instead, just saying, you know what, I don't know, but let's go find out.
Right.
Being willing to find the answer, and I definitely think that sort of like that destructive level of pride and even confidence that you can have.
I think that's a great also story. So kind of going back to the being more self-empathetic, is that when we start analyzing our fears? And do you think this is where design thinking comes into play into our conversations that we have with ourselves about facing things that we're struggling?
Yeah, I mean, I guess where it comes to the empathy side of it, I think it's not just like self-empathy, but it's sort of a empathy of, I think really empathy of other people is more important in some ways because, you know, again, being able to say, well, if I'm having the problem, somebody else probably has this problem too.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? They might have it in a different way, you know? So if I'm freaking out about this one thing, or I'm freaking out about how I manage something and I hold it in, you know, they're probably going through something similar, you know, and maybe it's not in the same realm as what you're dealing with, but if I can share with you, and again, being vulnerable and saying, well, you know what, I'm just sort of freaking out about this thing right now. I don't know if I'm going to do well at it. You know, they might turn around and say, you know what, I'm dealing with this other thing. And, you know, it's sometimes just having that, like that empathy to, or where you can build empathy with someone is enough to sort of motivate you to try, just because you want to help that person in some cases, you know? So sometimes just sort of taking yourself out of the equation can actually help more, you know, more than you may realize.
Well, it's even the guy you gave the little cheat sheet to, right? It was stuff that he might be able to use in the future at another place when he's talking with a designer. Because now you took the time and you were vulnerable and said, hey, here's kind of the cheat sheet I used from everything you taught me. Maybe you can use this with somebody else in the future, just to save them a little bit of the steps, right? So I think that's a great example of empathy for other people, and then you go ahead and share it. Instead of it just keeping it at your desk, you were happy to share it with the person as well as anybody else who was working with you, probably as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we all have we use these words, design thinking, and you and I had this conversation the other day. How do you define design thinking?
So I'm actually going to read the description that CEO Tim Brown, the CEO of IDEO, gives for design thinking, because IDEO has really helped usher a lot of that mindset. So he says, design thinking is a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. So what I've really come to like a lot about the design thinking thing is, you know, even since we had our first talk back in January, one of the things I've always been thinking about is like, who am I as a designer? Because again, I've always viewed design in a slightly different light, because I got into it from an aspect that most people don't. Most people, you know, may get into design from, you know, being into arts, and then they move into design. Whereas I came from more of a development and sort of an analytical side, moved into design. And the reason I enjoy design was because of the analytical portions that come in to it. And so I always have liked the design process. And I've actually sort of come to the realization that I'm more so a design, and like I enjoy like designing UX strategy more so than I even necessarily care about making the design. Like I don't necessarily care if I make the design. I just like helping build the strategy that, you know, is impactful. So I've enjoyed the design thinking stuff, just because it is a lot about that process, but it's also about bringing empathy into that process, because, you know, the work we do on almost a daily basis as a designer is thinking of other people, you know, is being considerate of what someone else's needs are and what they might need at that particular juncture in time. So, you know, with design thinking, I mean, I don't think in some ways, I don't think design thinking is necessarily applicable to maybe actually designing something, you know, because that is sometimes a more personal thing where you're taking ideas and you're designing for it. But when you start, especially working in teams, and you're working with people who maybe don't have empathy for what you have to go through, it helps put everybody at the table. So, you know, like here in my office, I mean, I'm a designer, but I have developers that I work with. I have project managers that I work with, salespeople, CEO who is thinking about a lot of things, finance people, you know, all these different people who all have things that they want out of something. And, you know, you have to take all of those things sometimes into account. And at the same time, you have to take into account who you're actually making it for.
Right.
You know? So really, the design thinking perspective is all about bringing everybody into the room so that you're able to, instead of making guesses on what people want, you're able to talk a little more about how everybody perceives it, so that, you know, when you actually get into designing something, you can say, well, you know, I know that, again, if I'm designing this like a website comp, I know that the developer is going to need
Right.
these things. So I need to design around those elements. But I also know that the impact for the user is just that they want to come into your store and buy it. So how do I make it easier for them to go in and do that? At the same time, how do I help meet the needs of the client who they have real needs? They, whether it's to make money or to you know, give their customer the best product, how do I help represent those things? And it becomes less about just me making a design that looks good just for me.
Right.
It's something that is actually useful to everyone who has stake in the process.
You and I talked about the other day, and you had this brilliant, ooh, it's a really loud thunder. You had oh, you did? Okay. See, it really is raining. You had this brilliant quote that it was just you talking. You said that sometimes you have to have conversations with clients, and said, I'm not designing this for you. I'm designing this for your customers, for your customers, for your clients' customers. And I think that that's something that we have to keep in the forefront. And we have all these people's needs that we're trying to make reality. But in the end, it's that user who's doing it or going to the thing or using the website or how they're doing it that I thought was just brilliant. I didn't want you to leave that out. That was a great thing.
No, I mean, like, that's one of my favorite things to say to clients. Like, it's always in my back pocket whenever I have debates with clients, you know, because I had, you know, a client who's like, oh, well, I really don't like this color and I don't like these styles and I don't like these things. And those aren't things that I would do. And I'm like, well, I do respect that. And in some ways, again, you have to bring their personality into it because you want the brand to represent them. But there are certain things where you're like, you know what, though, this is going to have the higher impact on the people you want to talk to. It's like, you're not going to buy your own stuff. Hopefully, if you are, you're doing it wrong. Right. And it's like, you know, so it's like, what are they going to get out of it? What are they going to see? And usually when I have those debates, and, you know, because I think there's also that debate, that back and forth that you have with clients, because I think sometimes they will feel like you're at odds because they're like, well, you know, your job is just to make this look good. And it's like, no, actually my job is to make it work. And if, you know, part of making it work is making it look good. But if it doesn't work, then it's not a good design. Exactly.
And if it doesn't reach the right audience, it's not a good design.
Right.
Right. So how can we make more of these conversations, or how can we begin to have some more of these conversations outside of design, but still bring into some of that design thinking? Because I know buzzword wise, it's all over, right? CEOs are talking about this, and they're not talking about design necessarily. They really are talking about empathy. They're talking about, in general, the realm of design. They're not talking about pushing pixels. So how do you think we can bring that conversation together? If maybe you're in a company and you're the boss or the president or CEO doesn't really value some of these things, how can you bring that to the table? And
so I think that's ultimately, so I think in the sense of designers, as I said, being like dealers in empathy or dealers of empathy, it's the idea that, you know, it's our job to figure out how to communicate with people, you know. So it's like, in a way, it's not necessarily the other person's, it's not necessarily right for us to expect, or feasible for us to expect, that they're able to speak our language, because that's not what we do. We don't, like, you know, we don't design things just for us. We design things for other people. So ultimately everything we do is about considering other people. So when it comes to helping people understand those things, we have to understand how to speak the language. And that's sort of why, like, with the new talk I've been working on, which I won't say the actual title, but it's just freaking design, which is, it's sort of the idea that, like, all of these things are just part of the designer's toolkit of building empathy, so I think we have to just learn to get involved. And I feel like we have this idea of designers being like so different from everyone else that we think that, well, we get to go into our own little hole and then we design something and then we come out and it's amazing and everybody loves it and we did our job and we walk off, and nobody knows what we do and nobody can understand it. But
Right.
we have this language that we speak together and then we come out and it's amazing. And it's like, it doesn't always work that way. And, in a lot of situations, you don't have that that luxury, and in some ways you don't have that trust. So what happens is designers in some ways get commoditized, and that's where you have those like buzzwords of design thinking being used in the manner that isn't sometimes always appropriate, because someone thinks that, oh well, we'll do all these little things with sticky notes and we'll do these little exercises, but we're not really thinking about the real impact of our empathy, and we aren't thinking about all of those things that usually designers should. But it's because they don't, and in a lot of cases, value our voices because we haven't necessarily tried to bring our voice to the table by showing that we can understand, like if I can sit down with my CEO and I can say, this is why you need to respect the design process, because if your design process is better, then that means that your clients are going to be happier because we've created things that the user, their customers, are responding to, because we're using all of these different skills to have empathy for their customer. And then we're creating communications that are then impactful for them, which in turn helps the client's bottom line, in turn helping us build our portfolio. But if we don't understand how to sit and talk to them on a level that they understand, and we just talk about, well, you want to make, if we talk about just how we feel about things, or, how we lay things out, and, using design, just understanding our own language, it doesn't work because they don't understand that. So they have
Right.
no empathy for it. So, yeah.
So it's also, this is one of your strengths, where it's customer service. To be honest, you're really empathizing with the customer. And maybe it was that you had great training at Apple. I don't know. I know you had great training at Apple, and I know you believe in Apple, but and as do I. But finding your strengths, they're not always necessarily pixels or illustrators. Sometimes it's these soft skills, and these soft skills I think have really helped you to be able to be a better web designer and a better communicator with developers, all those things. So how have you figured out how to use these to make money, to move ahead in the field?
I think just the idea of using those skills to help people understand where I'm coming from, I guess. Mm-hmm. And being willing to engage. And I think that's the thing, you'll find like a lot of times people just won't want to engage with outside of the profession sometimes. And it was a really a Rick Raffet quote that really resonated with me, which he was saying, designers have really done a disservice to themselves by viewing themselves as different. So for me, it was being able to go into a room and say, well, you know what? No, I'm not that much different, because I understand how to level with you, and I understand how to talk with you in a way that you understand. It makes you respect me more, and then that makes you value me more. So that's sort of, I guess that's sort of how I've always looked at it, because one of my big frustrations was always like, I've done so many different things. I mean, I've done sales, I've run my own business, I managed a bookstore, and it was always funny when people would be like, oh, you know, any of those times when I talk to people like that, oh, I bet that sucks, man. I bet you just wish you were designing. And I'd be like, I am designing. Like, I'm learning, like working at a bookstore, I'm learning how to manage certain things. So next time, if I ever go into a project, I understand what they have to go through. You know what I mean? If I'm working with salespeople, I understand what they need to get out of it. So I understand how to design something that works for them,
Right.
or help them move along with getting more clients or whatever it is. If I'm, again, working with someone who's just a business person, I understand what I had to go through in running my own business. And I understand that, just because it might be the most amazing design, if the margins on it are lopsided, then it's going to not work for them because they have to look at the bottom line. So how do I make these things work? And if I, go into it showing that, hey, I've considered you, then hopefully you're going to consider me. You're going to have some consideration for me, and we're going to, again, have empathy on those levels.
So it's not just about an experience. It's no experience is a wasted experience, because you can use
Right.
all those. You can go back to all those things. And it's good that you've had a lot of different variety in roles that you've played, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Again, it's like you said, it's just having all of these different experiences have just made me understand certain situations more. And I think that's a matter where I think in design terms, there's this idea or this feeling where it's like, well, if you're not making the thing, then you're not a real designer. If you're not doing print design, then you're not a real designer. You're just doing web design stuff. That's not real design. Are you, if you're, but it's like, that's not true. Like, you are using these skills still, and you're still doing it. Like, I remember I was listening to NPR one day, and they were talking about debt collectors, and they were talking about the stress and things that people will go through. And they were talking to this one woman, and she's talking about how she's been doing it, and she's like, yeah, well, I went to school for graphic design, or I went to school for design, and I guess I'm not doing that anymore. And I'm now, working with these people, and I'm sitting there, I'm listening to her talk about how she's using her design skills to help people, like how she's using things like empathy and things like that to help make people more comfortable when she is dealing in a field where most people don't like you when you talk to them on the phone, because you're trying to get money from them. And so, how she's using these skills, and she's trying to help them come to a conclusion that will not only help the company she's worked for collect a debt, but help those people. And I'm sitting there listening to her going, you're using your design skills.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, you're not making a flyer, or you're not doing something that's printed, but you actually are using your design skills.
Right. That's a great point. I love that. So we only have a little bit of time left, and I want to make sure we cover this. So courage is something that you have had to reach in and grab a lot of times for a lot of different situations. When we're facing fear, we all have this, right? But it's different at different times in our lives. I don't think we're always probably reaching back to the same place that helped us overcome something. So where do you find your courage, and how has it changed in different stages of your life?
I guess yeah, it has changed in different stages. I think that for me, initially, it was an idea of, again, I thought I had to be confident to have courage. And so in some ways that was not the best approach for me. It did lead me to, whether it was not be the best teammate or be the best employee or whatever it was, because again, I thought I had to be the end all be all, or I thought I had to, I should know already, so being prideful and things like that. I thought that's what it meant to be confident and to have courage.
Right.
But I think the courage ultimately just comes from sort of admitting sometimes that I don't know, sometimes admitting that I'm not always confident in something. but that I'm going to try it anyway. And, you know, just sort of that willingness to try. And, you know, that was something that, uh, again, you know, I tend to take like things that when I meet people or talk to people, and there's things that people will say to me that just resonate with me, and those will stick. Um, but the one in particular was a conversation I had with Debbie Millman and at a talk that she had given in New York a couple years ago, and she was talking about the need or the feeling of courage versus confidence, and she was saying, you know, it takes courage to build confidence.
Mm.
And you know, to me that really sort of stuck with me, where it was like, you know, it was sort of like, okay, yeah, so it's okay not to feel confident, or, you know, it was always sort of like you beat yourself up when you don't feel confident. And so it was sort of like to stop beating myself up about not feeling confident about things,
Mm-hmm.
and just sort of being like, in a way, it's sort of like whatever, you know. Sort of, I sometimes have a bit of a nonchalant attitude about things because I'm just like, whatever. It is, in some ways, it is what it is, and you know, you can only work with what you have, and you know, you know, oh well, I guess.
No, I love that. Kim also likes that. Takes courage to build confidence. So Debbie Millman told you that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we kind of already talked about how your new role in your company is embracing some of these things. So what's next for you? So you have a talk coming up.
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk a little bit about that stuff?
Yeah. So upcoming, I'll actually be over at the Richmond and Hampton Roads AIGA chapters, speaking with their members there, doing the In Defense of Fear talk. And then a few weeks ago, or about a month ago, submitted a talk idea that I've been working on for a while, which is called "It's Just Frickin' Design," and it's really, again, talking to those frustrations of being someone who started on the other end of the design spectrum and trying to move maybe more into the center of it,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, meeting people and talking to them about things like web design, and people going, oh, I would never, I don't do that stuff, that's not my thing, I can't do it. And I'm sitting there going, well, you know, that's like everything right now. You know, it is more about, you know, web and digital design than it is about a lot of things. And, you know, again, talking to people, and when I talk to people about my background in sales, and I'm going, I hate sales, I can't do sales. I was like, well, how are you ever going to get work? You know, how are you ever going to like know how to like, you know, even get jobs, even outside of just picking up independent clients? And then, you know, the idea that right now design is at a point where a lot of people are sort of asking for it. There's more interest in design than there's been a lot of times in the past. And because of that, though, and because of, again, our unwillingness to like get involved in areas that aren't traditionally considered design, we sort of are getting left out of those conversations. So it's bringing some parallels, and driving really home the point that designers aren't just, you know, design isn't just the thing that you make. It's like the empathy that you're building with people and that you create besides that. So, you know, when we think of like this idea that like if you're not creating the thing, you're not actually a designer, it's like, well, no, you are designing, but you have to understand how to use those skills. Because yes, like we're really at a point where design should have and could have, and I mean, there was an inkart.com article about how like designers are the next generation of CEOs.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, if we're not willing to learn how to speak that language, we're not going to get a spot at the table. It's like,
Right.
you know, that's what I thought we all wanted. So yeah.
Right. Exactly. So you have this talk coming up. When is that talk?
Yes, that's so WordCamp Baltimore, it's like a WordPress conference that they do every year. And that particular talk, it's a 2-day conference, but it'll be on the first day, which is Saturday, October 14th.
Okay.
And it'll be at the Charles Village location for WordCamp. And if you go to It's 17.baltimore.wordcamp.org. You can find the whole schedule there and get details on that. And I can actually post that in the chat if you would like.
I'm doing it.
Easy
I
enough.
think 17 is 17 or is it
Oh, I'm
spelled
sorry.
out?
I said, yeah, here, I'll post it. 2000.
Oh, 2007. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, that will be the talk. It'll be at 1:30. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that and sort of getting the chance to share that talk. Like I said, I'll be speaking over at the Richmond and Hampton Roads chapter for AIGA.
When is that? Is it at the same time? Is that at the word camp?
No, that's October 4th and 5th.
Okay.
So October 4th, it'll be Richmond, and then October 5th,
Hampton Roads.
next day over in Hampton Roads. So
Gotcha.
There's a chance I sort of do the idea, because at the time that we started talking about it, I hadn't really started the development and the finalization of the It's Just Freaking Design talk. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really throw that as an idea, but since I've been working on it and I was already preparing it for WordCamp, I threw the idea of possibly doing it at one of the chapters. So there's a chance I'd end up doing that one at one of the chapters instead, but right now it's probably going to just be the Indefensive Fear talk.
Oh, cool. Both of them are great. So I want to make sure that everybody knows how to follow you, mm-hmm. and I'm going to spell them out so that it's not, if anybody's listening, you can also follow, it's Anthony Brown Creates, is the website. So www.anthonybrown.creates.com. And then everywhere else, it's A Brown Creates with an S on the end. And that's Twitter, Instagram, things like that. So it's in the chat as well. So Joseph, that's why I think I always thought it was Anthony and then Joseph. But anyway.
So it's really funny. Anthony Brown, in some ways, was sort of precipitous to the Indefensive Fear and all that type of stuff, and it's sort of what led to some of that was because, long story, but just I sort of grew up I always went by Joe Carter, and then my name is hyphenated, so Carter-Brown, and I was always like reluctant to do the whole hyphenation thing, and so I'd always be like, no, I'm Joe Carter, and when people would call me Joe Brown or something, I'm like, no, it's Carter. And sort of when I started to embrace this idea of like making myself uncomfortable with things and really like in a way chasing after fears, it was sort of like, well, it makes me uncomfortable when, the Brown part of my name comes out. So I was like, well, I might as well just make myself completely uncomfortable and use that. My middle name is Anthony. So I was just like, I'm going to go total superhero alter ego on it and just be like Anthony Brown and just do it that way.
I like it.
Knows who I am. It's like, are you Joe? Are you Anthony?
It's the dual you. It's who are you today, right?
Yeah, it's for when I start robbing banks, really.
Whatever. You're never gonna do that. I think that's great. But it is nice that it's A and then Brown Creates, because then it's easy to kind of, if you didn't know that your name had Anthony in there. So I do see Diane Gibbs for my other, and I very rarely tell what my first name is. And my mom's here, and so she did not want to name me that in the big, as my first name. It's Constance. Please don't ever anybody call me Constance. No offense to anybody named Constance. It just doesn't fit me as a name.
Right.
So it's the same sort of thing. So I hear you. But I'm not gonna do an alter ego with Constance. She would be like some girl that always wore really frilly dresses, I think. And I'm more of the girl who's gonna climb the tree, not sit under it. Ladylike, probably.
Yeah, no, my thing was like, the more things make me cringe, I've learned to just like embrace it. So like that made me cringe at a certain point. I was like, all right, well, I guess I'm doing it. But
you've embraced it. You've embraced it. So this is another little, just a small example of a way that you embraced it. One with Anthony, a name that you didn't go by, and then you tacked on Brown, right?
Right.
I think that's great. You had told me about the hyphenation and the Brown part, but I didn't know about the Anthony. So I think that's great. I love that. Well, Joe, thank you so much for being on today. I always appreciate you being on. You're very wise and always bring a good different perspective and something we need to remember. So being able to embrace our fears, as well as, I like the Pollyanna kind of attitude. So go you on that. But then also really reminding us that what we do is empathize, and that's where is all of our strengths if we're a really good designer. So I just wanted to tell you thank you for that. And then next week we have Alex Lazarus, and I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, but I'll find out this week as I do at my pre-test with him. So he will be on. He is an amazing illustrator. He's a senior designer at Twitch. And so I'm excited to kind of dig into his story. I had met him. I'd seen his work for years on Dribble and things like that. And I got to meet him at Creative South this past year, and he was incredible. So everybody teamed up for this Adobe camp, or whatever the thing where you're like going at it together for a few or 4 hours or something. And he did it by himself, and he just rocked it. Creative Jam. Thank you, Amy. It was amazing that he could do what he did in that amount of time. So I'll make sure he shows that. So next week we'll be able to see that. But Joe, thank you again so much, and always a pleasure. So make sure you guys follow Joe at A Brown Creates, with the S on the end, on Instagram and Twitter, and then check his site out at anthonybrown.creates.com.
Yeah. And if you're ever in Baltimore, AIJ events is usually where I roam.
You can find him there, and he's really tall, just so you know. Well, everybody's really tall to me, but you're really tall. How tall?
I'm 6'1".
Yeah, me too. No, I'm just kidding. 5'1". You got 12 inches on me. And if you want to get in touch with me, or if you had a show idea, feel free to email me at diane@rechargingyou.com. And I'm happy to take ideas, anything. If you have something that you want me to talk about, or something that you're struggling with, I'm happy to do that. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Design Recharge. So I will see you guys next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Oops. Boogers. I forgot.